Hello and welcome to Climb's podcast series Advancing Vietnam with me, Vlad Savin, as your host. Throughout the following episodes, we're looking to answering relevant questions about doing business in Vietnam. What are the opportunities and challenges faced by investors entering the market or existing players in major industries? We will seek to understand the business environment from a cultural, local mindset and how to deal with compliance from an international perspective. What are the major risks faced by businesses active in the region and how to overcome them? We will dive deep into the compliance environment in Vietnam, discussing processes and procedures, changes in laws, latest official updates from the authorities, and financial governance planning for businesses active in Vietnam. We at the Climb consider compliance a major asset for foreign investors operating in Vietnam. We emphasize this aspect when speaking with our clients, and we make sure they understand the significant benefits of being compliant. In this episode, I'm discussing with Matthew Lowry, managing partner at Climb Vietnam, about how work permits in Vietnam work, looking at the most recent updates from the Vietnamese authorities, current practice in application process, special provisions to be aware of, exemptions, and case studies. Matthew, welcome to our new Advancing Vietnam podcast series. Work permits have been historically debated by international working community in Vietnam, mostly because the benefits they offer are substantial. However, the process of obtaining them is tedious and not always as robust as individuals and businesses would expect.
Oh, great to be here, and I look forward to talking about it.
Matthew, the regulation on the work permits in Vietnam is constantly changing and updating for the last few years. What do you think the authorities are releasing on this important topic for foreign investors, and what are their latest updates for 2022 regarding the work permit application process?
So let's start though, before we go into 2022 and where we're at, what the rules are regarding work permits. So the foundation is that foreign individuals are not permitted to work in Vietnam and sign a labour contract without a work permit. Now, there are work permit exemption categories that are required to be in place prior to signing a labour contract. So it's very important. You cannot sign a labour contract, not even probation, without a work permit or an exemption. And that generally means in your hand the exemption or exemption certificate before you sign the labour contract. That's not the perception in the community often, but it is the way the law works. And it's restrictive. It's restrictive to protect the Vietnamese society and to make sure those foreigners who are working in Vietnam are appropriate for the roles, the job, and the situation of Vietnam. So that's the sort of foundation, and we've got to keep that in mind because a lot of issues you see in the community are those who do not have work permits and haven't followed the process and then start having difficulties meeting otherwise because they should never have been employed in the role because they just don't meet the requirements. 2022, what we saw in 2021 was we saw the new labour code come into place at the start of the year, which stepped back the rules quite a bit, made it much harder. Then during 2021, the Prime Minister and the government released some relaxation of that, and we've seen sort of the Decision 105 reducing that. Decree 152 is implementing decree of the law, and then we're in a situation now where we have sort of in between. We have a more relaxed than we had at the start of the year, but not completely clear in all provinces how the work permits work. There is a draft decree out to bring everything back together into one so that the law, the decrees, the government announcements all match. Basically, the context of that is that if you have a relevant degree, not specific to the role, but it must be relevant in some way, if you have appropriate experience for that role, and you can get a criminal check and health check, you can be employed. So it's about you must be qualified and appropriately experienced is the general rule. Now there are different categories, but that's just the general concept. If someone wants to work in Vietnam in 2022 who does not have experience in a role and doesn't have any qualifications in that role and just wants to do it because it's an exciting opportunity, they'll unlikely will be able to obtain a work permit.
And you mentioned categories. Let's look at the three types of work permit applications. You have the expert application, management application, and technical expert application, as they call it. Can you explain what are the differences between these three types of applications in practice?
So there's actually more than three types, Vlad, but they're the three most common types you've mentioned. So there is also the foreign transfer and a few other types. But let's focus on those three because that's what the vast majority of foreign individuals face. You've got expert, manager, and technical. Expert is the standard one, which is the most common, which as I mentioned is the must have a suitable post Tertiary education, degree, relevant. Relevant, you must have experience, 3 years minimum experience, and you must be health and criminal checks. That's the most common one. Now, for those who either don't have a degree or don't have relevant experience, they then start looking at the other options. The next one is management. Management is the head of a department or the company. Now, when they say department, the law, it's what the authorities intend is that you run either a branch or the company. You're named on the investment certificate as the head. And it's not just I'm important, it is I am the boss. That's fundamentally what it is. If you are the boss, that management or boss of a clearly defined branch or something that the authorities will accept, you do not need a degree. You still must have relevant experience, and that relevant experience must be relevant to the role, but it means that someone who did not have any university qualifications but has experience in the role over many, many years meets the management requirements. The technical work permit is based around someone having a certificate, training appropriate, and experience. It is a much lower standard, and it's designed for someone who is a particular machinery operator or a technical operator in a facility that is needed to run a piece of equipment or do a particular role that is more technical in nature. They are not management. They are there for a technical skill set. So you must not only show that they've got the technical, got experience, a much lower level of years experience, but a certification. The problem is it needs to be government connected, so either issued or certified by a government authority that technical classification, that technical certification can be accepted by the Vietnamese authorities. So it does have some limitations. What it does is allow that if you need to bring someone into country to work, to run, set up a machine, run a factory production line, do a technical, and they don't have university, you still have a path to do that. The last thing is that all of these categories, there are specific fields and requirements, and so it's not just a matter of a blanket approach. Depending upon the field and what someone's looking at, you must look at this look at what it is, what's the job, and bring it down to what's necessary. A final thing just on that is work permit is 2 processes. The employer needs to make application that they wish to employ a foreigner for a role. Part 2 is, this is the foreigner I wish to employ and here are his details. So it's role, person, 2 steps. And that's important. You can't just rush that through. You've got to do those 2 steps.
Mm-hmm. What about the work permit exemptions? Who is entitled to apply for an exemption and what are the ultimate benefits for the holder?
There's about 19 exemption categories. So this is broad. Some of them are very short-term, very specific. Those short-term specific ones are very hard now because the border's been closed, but they are designed for someone to come in for a short period to provide a short amount of work, 30 days at a time, 3 months a year. So there's some short ones. Misunderstood by many, but they are there to allow experts to come in, not to come in and sign a labour contract. They're not there. You've got different exemptions for working in certain NGOs. You've got exemptions, for example, foreign lawyers who are registered with the Ministry of Justice can be exempt. There are a number of exemptions for investors if you've got enough money invested in your company. So it's not just because you're an investor, it's the amount of money. So these exemptions, they generally require an exemption certificate. That is akin to a work permit. So you need the exemption certificate before you can sign the labour contract. There's the other exemption which has come in place this year, which is if a foreign individual is married to a Vietnamese and has a temporary resident card to show that they are residing. Remember, the other one, we see foreigners married here is on a visa exemption certificate. That is not about residence. That's about ability to enter and stay. So it must be a temporary resident card. You can be exempt. That exemption process is a 3-day process. It's a very quick, fast process to do. So other exemption categories are also fast, but you must have the documents. That exemption, a standard exemption certificate, not for marriage, but standard is the same as the work permit. It looks the same, it's treated the same, and it's regarded in law and banking, everything else as being the same.
And it's as well for 2 years timeline?
Yeah, 2 years. So a exemption certificate or a work permit. Lawyers may be different. I'd have to take that on notice because there's some subtle differences to those who have legal practitioner certificate. But as a general rule, a work permit or a work permit exemption certificate is a 2-year document, because the labour contract can only be for 2 years. It's not for a marriage, that is subtly different, but that has a few different quirks.
Let's look a bit now about into more legal implications of the work permit, specifically on labor side. That's where it really gets interesting when you look into more depth. So in essence, the role of a work permit and work permit exemptions as well is to enable a foreign individual to perform labor activities in Vietnam, sign a legal and compliant labor contract with an employer in Vietnam. Then let's look at the first implication. Is a labor contract with a foreign employee valid when the employee doesn't have a work permit or work permit exemption?
We see this commonly. They're commonly about, I've signed a work permit, I've signed a labour contract, but I still don't have my work permit. That's an illegal labour contract, and under the law and precedent court cases, it is clear that that is a void contract. My understanding, I'm not a lawyer, my understanding is that if that contract is an illegal void contract and one party cancels and says that's void, then the contract ceases. Both parties should be in the position they signed before the contract. If you've done work, you get paid for it. If you haven't done work, you don't get paid. That's that break point. But you can't enforce anything else in that contract. So that is a position where I see people, I didn't sign a contract, my employer's trying to do this, or my employee is trying to do that. If you don't have a work permit, it's not covered by labour law rights, and the courts would put it back in the position you'd be before you signed it, to the point where if there was activities done, they'd be reimbursed as agreed, but it stops. So it is basically it's basically a handshake, and we all know how a handshake works. It is not legal. Now, just on that, if you are illegally working, the implications under the labour law and civil code is that you can be fined on both sides, and the individual can be deported from Vietnam. That is the recourse under law for working without a work permit.
Mm-hmm. So for the individual, deportation is that ultimate repercussion that they could enforce.
Absolutely, and it happens. I wouldn't say it happens a lot, but the authorities definitely use that. It is one of the tools that they use, correct.
And regarding the employer, what could they accept of a fine?
Significant penalties, but we also see the labour authorities putting out, and I don't know whether this is a legal or just simply a procedural penalty, but they basically stop them getting further work permits. They make it difficult. They say sort of that they're not in a position to be able to employ foreigners because of their past conduct. Mm-hmm. And we see the authorities make it quite difficult for the employer. That may cost more than the fine. That may be a much larger penalty than the fine is.
Mm-hmm. Let's look at the timeline then. In 2019 Labour Code, it is stated that the term of a labour contract with a foreign employee is always limited by the term of the work permit or work permit exemption, which is 2 years, as we discussed. Therefore, in practice, all foreign individuals working in Vietnam are essentially under a 2-year rolling labour contract. However, the new Labour Code introduced a couple of interesting exemptions, one in particular referring to the foreign individual married with a Vietnamese citizen. Can you explain more about this specific exemption?
Yes,
the exemption from the exemption. It's
a specific type of exemption that's different to the others. Yeah, and just so for those watching and listening, the 2019 Labour Code came into force on the 1st of January 2021. So just not to confuse it, it is something, the titles and dates, and that's because of the way the National Assembly 2 times a year, how they release things and the enough lead up time to implement. So from 1 January 2021, we saw these changes. So traditionally, the Vietnamese law says that if I sign a contract as a standard part of law, my first contract can be definite period up to 3 years. Second contract, definite period up to 3 years. My third contract is always indefinite. That's the default. And a lot of foreign employees had pushed in the past and says, well, the law says that doesn't have an exemption, therefore my third contract should be indefinite. Therefore you can't terminate. I've got a more notice period. I've got to be paid out more. And they use that as bargaining power. The courts had never accepted that, and the authorities never accepted, but it wasn't in law. So the 2019 Labour Code now introduces and specifically states that a foreign individual under a work permit can sign multiple 2-year rolling, or less than 2 years, if they choose 2 years a maximum, rolling contracts, and will not, by default, will not get in fact, cannot have an indefinite contract. So that clarifies. What they did is, as you touched on, is that a foreign individual married to a Vietnamese are not excluded and not included in that clause that says you can't have an indefinite contract. And so the indefinite contract clarification makes it very clear that a standard work permit exemption certificate holder or a work permit holder can only sign it. But the way they've defined it is that it's not a work permit certificate, exemption certificate, it's just a specific exemption outside of that clause. So you can, by default, you do an indefinite period, 2 years say, a definite period, 2 years, you can then do an indefinite. Now, that's good and bad for some employers, employees, but it does complicate things, but it also puts in the position where those foreign individuals here paying insurances, health insurance, paying pension plans, everyone now is in the same position as a Vietnamese individual with regard to their rights protection. If they've made it their home, they've got married, they've got their residence, it does put them in the same position as a Vietnamese individual. So in that context, it's the right thing to do. And we'll see how the courts enforce that later if it causes problems for either side.
And that's really interesting. Let's look at a real-world example then, based on this situation that we talked about, and let's look at the scenario that actually happened to a foreign individual here in Vietnam. In this scenario, the foreign individual was under work permit for 3 consecutive term contracts of 2 years each. And in 2021, the foreign individual married a Vietnamese citizen legally in order to perform labor activities and sign the labor contract. The foreign individual only needs to notify the Ministry of Labor about the position in the company without needing a work permit or work permit exemption. That is that new clause that you just mentioned.
I hope they didn't get married just for this purpose, though, Vlad.
You never know. We have to see. Therefore, if the labor contract term is not attached to either a work permit or a work permit exemption, the foreign individual would be now able to sign an indefinite term contract.
So the contracts would then follow the law, because the default is that let's say I've been working for someone, Vietnamese individual, working for a firm, and I don't sign a renewal, but I continue to work. No, neither party cancels the contract. It defaults to what the normal would be. So if in my company, if everyone got a 2-year contract, then an indefinite contract, that would be what would be expected if I failed to sign or the individual either failed to cancel, but we continue to work. You are deemed to have accepted a new contract on the terms that others would have accepted. So it would be 2-year, indefinite. The situation now is that it would be very difficult not to sign an indefinite in that scenario, because you can't fall back to the law to say that you can't sign. So yes, that's the process, that they would be able to do an indefinite, and I struggle to see that they could do a definite period, a 2-year contract again, because I think that would not be in line with the law. We haven't seen guidance, but that's what it looks like. To do this, as you mentioned, there's 3 days. 3 days before they start, the employer is supposed to notify the authorities. It needs to be stamped and accepted by the authorities, and you put them on the list as a foreign employee, and that notification of an exemption is in place. That's in place, then an individual is able to work. You are still required to notify the authorities of foreign individuals working. You've got to notify the authorities of work permits when you do your reporting. There will be a gap, and the authorities are aware of that, and things won't always line up nicely with work permits, labour contracts. They're no longer lining up. So it is something that I have seen, and you've got the example there. We've seen lots of those examples. We've also seen internal HR not accepting the exemption because they go, my work permits and my labour contracts and my management of foreign employees will no longer tie up. I'll have mixtures of foreign individuals with this exemption but being treated as locals, everything else, but I've got to report them differently, too hard, and they're refusing to accept. That's a procedural issue inside a company. That's not the law. The law is quite clear now in the process, and the authorities are stamping and accepting. There's no issue in doing this. They are following the law. Since Decree 152 in mid-February last year, the authorities have just applied this, and it's been quite surprising and refreshing how it hasn't been held up during bureaucratic processes. It's just been accepted that if you are married with the requirements, they just stamp it 3 days, and then you can commence signing a labour contract.
Mm-hmm. Matty, you've been in Vietnam for over 17 years already, and you certainly witnessed many changes on work permit matters. What advice would you give now to employers and employees interested in clarifying these work permit application issues and labor contract issues? What should be their key focus when preparing for these contracts and applications?
For employers, those entering Vietnam for the first time and those who have been here for a while, and as you say, I've seen many different versions go through of what people's plans are. Never assume or presume that you can just employ who you want. So with the foreign individuals, you need to plan. You need to plan, advertise, get the process. You may be able to find someone who meets a category and fasten the process. I would not assume you have. So my guidance is generally make sure you know what you're doing. Make sure that you've got the advice on when I need to advertise for the employer approval, employee approval. And secondly is when you're on that one is screening for applicants. If you are advertising, make sure they know the requirements before you even interview them. Make sure they specifically state they meet your requirements, because there's nothing worse than an employer having found the perfect candidate and they can't get a work permit. I have one client who has an individual who were, I think, been 9 months going through the process and updating. There's a whole range of complications. Luckily, they had they were a spouse, and therefore the legalities of being in Vietnam wasn't in question. But the ability to employ is just frustrating the employer. From an employee perspective, an individual wanting to work in Vietnam, it's not your right. It is something that you must meet. You satisfy the conditions, and we see this. Vietnam's a developing country. They'll need me. It doesn't quite work like that. But by all means, if you meet and have qualifications and have ability, you can work here. It's not that difficult to get the process underway if you meet the requirements. So before you start applying for jobs and going around, try to read up, understand what they are, understand that you meet the requirements. Because then if you approach an employer and saying, I meet the requirements that you'll need, you're ahead. You're the one who's likely to get employed. So it's this balance of understanding what the rules are before you start. And then its process is a process that can take, it can take 6 weeks, it can take 4 weeks, but you need to work through that process. That's the employer starting. The employee, it might take lesser time, but just make sure that you've got yourself ahead. And by the way, if you are going to come to Vietnam when the borders are opening up, or if you're in country already, get your documents in advance. If you're looking to change jobs, make sure your documents are up to date. And when I say that, that is notarized, legalized documents, to make sure that they're being stamped the right way and that you can just make it fast, because then there's no hold-ups to the process.
Right, make sure that you keep the old documents as well for the original application. Make sure you have the work permit and everything behind to settle for your future potential applications.
And I think that's very important, is that documents. So original documents you own, copies and even notarized copies may not be yours, because the law says in original documents, if you have a copy that's been notarized, that is not an original document. That's a copy that's been legalized for use, but been verified that this copy is a correct copy. But just because it's a copy, and I see people complaining, oh, my employers or the authorities kept my documents. It was a copy. They didn't keep it. So you're right. Ask for whatever you can back. Sometimes the copies are returned. They're not always returned. The originals are. Keep whatever you have. Make sure you have access to the originals, and just protect those, but just understand, sometimes you hand over a document, it's a copy with a stamp on it, you don't get it back because it was not the original, it was a verification of a photocopy.
Matthew, our time is up. Thank you again for this practical insights on the work permits. It's one of the topics that the business community is talking regularly across networking events and across different business meetings. It's really important that somebody like you that has 17 years experience can really navigate through these changes and explain in reality what would be that practical process and mindset that investors should have in regards to this.
Now, fantastic, good to talk, and I'm looking forward to the government to releasing the updated decrees, which brings the changes last year all into one, because I think that'll help the business community as well and give some more clarity. So great to talk to you.
Fantastic. Work permits are essentially one of the most important documents for international investors doing business in Vietnam. They enable foreign individuals to work legally in country and also protect businesses active in Vietnam in regards to the validity of their labor contracts with foreign employees, assuring a compliant labor process on both sides. We advise employers and employees to peruse the latest regulations on work permits and be informed of their rights and responsibilities regarding working in Vietnam in a compliant and legal manner. Thank you. And many thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in to Advancing Vietnam podcast series. For more information about this topic, please check out our publications on vietnam.acclaim.com. And if you want to reach out to us for any additional details, feel free to contact me on LinkedIn or throughout the website contact details.